All right, let's go. Number 10. Montgomery. In October 1942, the British Eighth Army was fighting with its back to the wall. German and Italian forces under Erwin Rommel had pushed deep into North Africa, and the front line sat just 60 miles from Alexandria. One more breakthrough, and Egypt would fall. The Suez Canal would fall with it, and the entire Allied position in the Mediterranean would collapse. The man sent to stop that from happening was General Bernard Montgomery, and almost nobody believed he could do it. Rommel had spent 18 months making fools of British commanders. He was faster, more unpredictable, and seemed to occupy a different mental dimension from the generals sent to stop him. Montgomery was known for caution, for meticulous preparation, and for an ego that irritated almost everyone around him. His peers questioned whether he had the instinct for decisive action that the moment demanded. What Montgomery understood, and what his critics missed, was that Rommel's Africa Corps was running on borrowed time. Supply lines across the Mediterranean were being savaged by Allied naval and air power, and Rommel's tanks were almost out of fuel. Montgomery didn't need to outfox the Desert Fox. He needed to grind him down. When he launched Operation Lightfoot on 23 October 1942, he did exactly that. The battle lasted 20 days. Montgomery committed approximately 195,000 Allied troops against an Axis force of around $116,000, and he refused to be drawn into the kind of fluid, fast-moving engagement where Rommel excelled. By 11 November, Axis forces had suffered roughly 59,000 casualties, and Rommel was retreating west in a route he would never reverse. Churchill told the House of Commons that before Alamein, the Allies never had a victory, and after Alamein, they never had a defeat. Montgomery was never the most daring general of the war, but El Alamein proved that, in the right hands, relentless calculated pressure can be just as decisive as audacity, and sometimes the steadiest hand in the room is the one that wins. Number 9. Yamamoto. On the morning of 7 December 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft swept in over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and changed the course of the 20th century. The man who planned that attack was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, and the strike he designed was so precise, so devastating, and so audacious that it remains one of the most studied operations in military history. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood American industrial capacity better than almost any other Japanese officer, and he had argued strenuously against going to war with the United States. He believed Japan could not win a prolonged conflict. He is reported to have warned Japanese leaders that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, but after that, he could offer no guarantees. That warning was not heeded. The Pearl Harbor strike force included 6 fleet carriers and 414 aircraft. It sank or damaged 19 American warships and killed 2,403 people. In purely military terms, it was a staggering tactical success. What Yamamoto could not destroy, however, were the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea that day. That absence would prove catastrophic. At the Battle of Midway, from 4 to 7th of June 1942, U.S. codebreakers under Commander Joseph Rochefort at Station Hypo had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to know where and when Yamamoto planned to strike. American forces were waiting. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 men in 4 days. The fleet Yamamoto had built was shattered. He was killed on 18th of April 1943 when U.S. fighters, acting on intercepted intelligence, shot down his transport aircraft over Bougainville. Yamamoto's genius created Japan's greatest victories, and his predictability, exploited by Allied codebreakers, created the conditions for its irreversible defeat. It is rare in history that a single mind is responsible for both the apex and the unraveling. Number 8. MacArthur. On 11th March 1942, General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to leave his besieged troops in the Philippines and escape by PT boat to Australia. He left with a promise. He would return, It was either the declaration of a man who understood the long game of war, or the vow of a general who had just abandoned 76,000 soldiers to Japanese captivity. What followed over the next 2.5 years would make the case that it was the former. MacArthur was a deeply complicated figure, simultaneously one of the most brilliant strategic minds and most difficult personalities in the American military. His commanders in Washington found him infuriating. His subordinates found him demanding. His enemies found him inexorable. When he was given command of Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, he immediately began reimagining how a Pacific war could be won. His answer was what became known as island hopping, or leapfrogging. Instead of assaulting every Japanese-held island in sequence, MacArthur proposed bypassing the strongest fortifications entirely, cutting off their supply lines, and letting the garrisons wither. The island of Rabaul held approximately 100,000 Japanese troops, the largest single concentration in the Pacific. MacArthur went around it. Those soldiers spent the rest of the war going nowhere. He returned to the Philippines on 20th October 1944, wading ashore at Leyte Gulf in one of the most deliberately theatrical moments of the war, an act he had planned with the same precision he brought to his campaigns. The battle that followed was one of the largest naval engagements in history, with nearly 300 vessels committed across 4 days of fighting. The liberation of the Philippines sealed the strategic strangulation of Japan. The question MacArthur answered at Leyte was not whether you could defeat an enemy's strength, but whether you needed to engage it at all. He decided you didn't, and the map of the Pacific War agreed with him. Number 7. Guderian. On 10th of May 1940, General Heinz Guderian led his Panzer Corps into the Ardennes forest, and French military doctrine began to die. Allied commanders had designated the Ardennes impassable for armored vehicles. Their defensive planning was built on that assumption. It was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations in the history of modern warfare. The French and British had positioned their best forces in Belgium, anticipating a German advance through the open northern plains, a replay of the First World War's opening moves. The Ardennes sat to the south, unguarded, and, they believed, irrelevant. Guderian had spent years arguing that tanks were not merely a supporting arm for infantry. They were the decisive weapon of modern war, capable of speed and penetration that no previous military theory had fully reckoned with. He proved it within 72 hours. His corps threaded through the Ardennes at a pace that stunned even the German high command. He reached the Meuse River at Sedan by 12th of May and crossed it under devastating air support on 13th in May, punching through the French defensive line before reinforcements could arrive. What happened next was less a battle than a collapse. Guderian drove his panzers west toward the English Channel, covering 240 miles in 11 days. By 20th of May, his forces reached Abbeville on the coast, cutting off the entire Allied Northern Army group. Some 338,226 British and Allied troops were evacuated from Dunkirk, only because Hitler issued a controversial halt order on 24th of May, a decision that remains debated by historians to this day. France surrendered on 22nd of June, 46 days after Guderian's tanks entered the trees. Guderian didn't just win a battle in May 1940. He demonstrated, at a scale the world couldn't ignore, that speed itself could be a weapon more devastating than any artillery, and that the greatest fortress is useless if the enemy simply drives around it. Number 6. Rokossovsky. On 23rd June 1944, the third anniversary of the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky launched an offensive that the Western world barely noticed. The eyes of the press were fixed on Normandy, where the Allied landings were still less than 3 weeks old. In the east, largely out of sight, Rokossovsky's forces were about to destroy an entire German army group. Military historians would later argue it was the most decisive single operation of the entire war. What made Rokossovsky's presence at the head of a Soviet front particularly extraordinary was where he had spent the years before the war. In 1937, during Stalin's purges of the Red Army Officer Corps, Rokossovsky was arrested on fabricated charges. He was tortured over several years, his teeth knocked out, several toes broken. He was released in 1940 specifically because the Soviet Union was running out of competent commanders, and the ones it had were needed too desperately to keep imprisoned. Operation Bagration, the offensive he helped design, was built around a principle so unorthodox that Stalin summoned Rokossovsky 3 separate times to change his plan. Rokossovsky proposed breaking through at 2 points simultaneously rather than concentrating force at one. 3 times he was asked to reconsider. 3 times he refused. Stalin, to his credit, ultimately approved it. The result was catastrophic for Germany. 4 Soviet fronts, comprising approximately 2.3 million men, tore through Army Group Center. German losses across the operation reached approximately 450,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, greater in scale than the losses at Stalingrad. Soviet forces advanced 450 miles west in 8 weeks, liberating Belorussia and reaching the borders of East Prussia. A man who survived Stalin's dungeons then went on to erase an entire German army group from the map. History very rarely produces that kind of relentless defiance twice over in a single life. Number 5. Slim. In March 1944, Japanese General Renya Mutaguchi launched Operation Yugo with 85,000 troops across the Indian border, aiming to cut Allied supply lines, seize the towns of Imphal and Kohima, and spark an uprising that would drive Britain out of India entirely. The plan was audacious, the terrain brutal, and on paper, the Japanese advance looked unstoppable. General William Slim, commanding the British 14th Army, had a different view. He thought it was exactly the opportunity he had been waiting for. Slim's 14th Army was known, with bitter affection, as the Forgotten Army. Fighting in the jungles and mountains of Burma, thousands of miles from the war's main theaters, they received a fraction of the attention, resources, and recognition given to forces in Europe or the Pacific. Slim himself was a different breed of commander, practical, unpretentious, deeply trusted by the men under him, and possessed of a strategic patience that consistently wrong-footed his opponents. His response to Mutaguchi's offensive was to let it come. Rather than fighting to hold the border, Slim pulled his forces back to prepared positions around Imphal and allowed the Japanese to advance deep into territory where their supply lines would become impossibly stretched. He then supplied Imphal entirely by air, with the RAF delivering approximately 19,000 tons of supplies during the siege, keeping the garrison fed, fueled, and fighting. The Japanese, supplied by what they could carry and capture, began to starve. Mutaguchi continued to order attacks long after his frontline units were too weakened to execute them. By July 1944, the offensive had collapsed entirely. Japanese forces suffered approximately 55,000 killed in the campaign, their worst defeat in the Burma theater. At Kohima, the fighting had been so close that opposing forces were separated, at one point, by a tennis court at the district commissioner's bungalow. How many commanders in history have deliberately invited encirclement and siege, then turned the trap around on the men who set it with such devastating, methodical precision? Number 4. Rommel. In February 1941, Erwin Rommel arrived in Libya with orders to stabilize a collapsing Italian front and hold the line. He immediately began attacking. His superiors in Berlin told him to wait for reinforcements. He kept moving. They ordered him to consolidate his gains. He advanced. His Panzer Corps moved so fast and so unpredictably across the desert that German headquarters temporarily lost track of where he was, which is how the 7th Panzer Division acquired the nickname that would follow Rommel for the rest of the war, the Ghost Division. What made Rommel dangerous was not simply his tactical instinct, formidable as it was. It was the psychological effect he had on the men opposing him. British commanders began making decisions based not on where Rommel was, but on where they feared he might be. That fear created hesitation, and hesitation in armored warfare is often fatal. He captured the fortress of Tobruk on 21st of June 1942, a position that had resisted siege for over 230 days the previous year, and he did it in a single day of concentrated, relentless assault. He was promoted to field marshal the same day, the youngest in the German army. Winston Churchill told the House of Commons, and the phrase became one of the war's most quoted lines, that across the havoc of war, the Allies faced a very daring and skillful opponent, and a great general. It was a remarkable tribute from a prime minister to the man his own forces were struggling to stop. Rommel's Africa Corps achieved its results with a fraction of the resources available to either side in the European theater. He was repeatedly outgunned, outsupplied, and ultimately outnumbered. Yet he kept the entire Allied North African campaign off balance for nearly 2 years through sheer operational improvisation. Rommel turned psychological dominance into a battlefield instrument, and he wielded it with such force that the Allied world found itself openly admiring the man it was trying to defeat. Number 3. Patton. On the evening of 18th of December 1944, with German forces pouring through the Ardennes in the largest offensive the Western Front had seen in years, General Dwight Eisenhower convened a crisis meeting at Verdun. He needed to know how quickly Third Army could disengage from its current front, pivot 90 degrees to the north, and drive to relieve the encircled 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne. He turned to General George Patton and asked. Patton said he could move with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went quiet. Several officers laughed. Nobody thought it was possible. Patton had already anticipated the question. Before the meeting, he had telephoned his chief of staff and issued prearranged code words that set 3 separate contingency plans into motion. He had gamed out the German offensive before it began, and he had prepared his staff for the possibility of exactly this pivot. What looked to the room like reckless confidence was, in fact, the product of a commander who thought several moves ahead at all times and refused to be caught without options. In conditions of snow, ice, and one of the worst European winters on record, Patton moved approximately 133,000 vehicles and 250,000 men in 72 hours. Third Army punched through to Bastogne on 26th of December, relieving the garrison 4 days after Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe had responded to the German demand for surrender with a single word: nuts. The relief of Bastogne was extraordinary, but it was not an isolated moment. Patton's Third Army liberated more territory and captured more prisoners than any other Allied force in the European theater. During the August 1944 breakout from Normandy, his forces advanced at a rate that averaged over 50 miles per day, outpacing the ability of his own supply chain to keep up. At what point does operational speed stop being logistics and start being something for which no military manual has a name? Number 2. Manstein. In February 1943, the German position in southern Russia was falling apart. Stalingrad had just concluded in the greatest German military defeat of the war, with Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendering the entire 6th Army on 2nd February. Soviet forces were advancing across a front of nearly 300 miles, fueled by momentum and the conviction that they had broken the German army's will. Every military logic suggested the collapse would continue. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein looked at the same maps everyone else was looking at and saw something entirely different. What Manstein saw was a trap that his enemy was walking into. Soviet armored spearheads had advanced so rapidly that they had outrun their supply lines. The further they pushed, the more exposed and exhausted they became. He called this kind of operation the backhand blow, absorbing an enemy's advance until their momentum was spent, then striking at the precise moment when they were most vulnerable. The theory was elegant. Executing it with shattered, exhausted formations on a frozen steppe was another matter entirely. He did it anyway. Between 19th of February and 15th of March 1943, Manstein's Army Group South counterattacked into the overextended Soviet lines, recaptured Kharkov, and inflicted approximately 52,000 casualties on Soviet forces that days earlier had believed they were winning. It was one of the most complete reversals of fortune in the entire war, accomplished with remnants of formations that had been written off by their own high command. The operation is now studied at military academies around the world as the definitive example of elastic defense and operational counterattack. It was Manstein's earlier architectural work that had also produced the Ardennes breakthrough plan that conquered France in 6 weeks, a plan initially rejected by Hitler before being approved at the urging of senior staff. Military historians have debated for 80 years who was the greatest operational mind of the Second World War, and the Third Battle of Kharkov is the reason Manstein's name is always the first one mentioned, and the hardest to argue against. Number 1. Zhukov. In October 1941, German Army Group Center was driving toward Moscow with nearly 1.9 million men and over 1,000 tanks along the Central Axis, the largest single military force ever assembled and directed at a single objective. Hitler had declared the Soviet Union essentially defeated. His generals believed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin's towers from their forward positions. Stalin, reportedly shaken to the point of near paralysis, began making arrangements to evacuate the capital. The man he summoned to hold the line was General Georgy Zhukov, and Zhukov told him, without qualification, that Moscow would not fall. At the moment Zhukov made that declaration, he had fewer than 90,000 men and fewer than 200 tanks available to defend a city of 6 million people. What he had instead was a calculation. Soviet intelligence, much of it sourced from the spy Richard Sorg operating in Tokyo, indicated that Japan would not open a second front against the Soviet Union in the east. Zhukov took that intelligence and acted on it with a decisiveness that bordered on recklessness, stripping 18 veteran divisions from the Soviet Far Eastern Army and moving them by rail across thousands of miles to Moscow. Those divisions were winter-trained, properly equipped for sub-zero combat, and they arrived at exactly the moment they were needed. The German advance stalled in the Moscow suburbs in early December 1941, in temperatures that fell to minus 30 degrees Celsius. German soldiers had not been issued winter uniforms, the consequence of a high command that had promised its forces would be home before the cold arrived. On 5th of December, Zhukov launched his counteroffensive into the teeth of the Russian winter, and the German army began to retreat for the first time in the war. That was only the beginning. In November 1942, Zhukov co-designed Operation Uranus with General Alexander Vasilevsky, the encirclement operation that closed around the German 6th Army at Stalingrad. When the trap shut on 23 November, approximately 330,000 German and Axis troops were surrounded. Paulus surrendered on 2 February 1943 with roughly 91,000 survivors. Zhukov was then at Kursk, then at the grinding liberation of Eastern Europe, then at the walls of Berlin. He accepted Germany's unconditional surrender on 8th May 1945. He was present at every strategic turning point on the Eastern Front, the theater where the war was ultimately decided. And at every one of those moments, the outcome was different because he was there. History is full of commanders who won battles against the odds. Zhukov won the battles that, had he lost them, would have ended the story entirely. If Moscow had fallen in December 1941, the Soviet Union falls with it, and the entire shape of the 20th century changes. That it didn't. That a city of 6 million people held against the largest army ever assembled is more than the story of one battle or one campaign. It is the story of one man's absolute refusal to accept what the numbers said was inevitable. And the reason that refusal mattered is that this time the numbers were almost right. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.